Chapter 4. The Rune That Binds. Jan woke in the morning, under covers and in a tent. He didn't know how he got there, but when he rolled out from under the covers, he found that he'd been undressed. There was no sign of his old torn clothes, but new clean ones were laid out for him. Sitting on top of them was the tock blade Talus had given him. Someone had found a sheath and a belt for it. He found fresh water in a pitcher and washed mechanically and then dressed. The clothes were a little big for him, but fit well enough. When he finished dressing, he buckled the knife belt around his waist. The weight of the dagger felt odd, even though he had carried a knife before when he'd gone hunting with his father. He froze at the thought, pushed it back. He was not ready for memories. Instead, he pulled the knife out and stared at its blade. For a moment, he toyed with the idea of driving it into his heart, but it was fleeting. In the end, he had not thrown himself in the flames of his family's pyre, and he would not end his life here. Beneath the numbness, felt on an unconscious level, something else stirred. It was too faint an emotion for him to feel, let alone be aware of, so it slipped past his defenses and unsuppressed, buried itself in his heart, there to smoulder and slowly fill his soul with its essence. Hate. Sheathing the knife, he stepped out of the tent and into the camp. Though he'd heard stories of the nomadic Thai year and even seen a few who had come to SOMMERSTONE over the years, the sight of the camp still intact after a night without walls made the stories more real, less the fables of childhood. Here were men who did not cower in the night. The staffs were still up, their wards in place, but with the sun in the heavens, the nohetka had gone to shelter. They had crawled under rocks and into brambles to escape the light of day. Under the sun, a man could walk without fear of the dead. Unsure of what he should do, Jan walked the camp, watching the men go about their chores. A group of bare-chested men standing in a circle that formed a clearing at their center caught his attention. They were stretching their arms and legs while conversing with one another. Though he was still numb inside, he felt a twinge of curiosity. Or maybe it was just the most convenient place to be. Whatever the reason, Jan went over to see what they were doing. Moments after he arrived, Ulrich appeared moving through the camp toward the circle of men. He stood a head taller than most of the other Thai. He passed Jan, sparing a quick glance and nod. Walking over to one of the men in the circle, he tapped him on the shoulder and walked to the middle of the clearing. Like the other men, Ulrich had his shirt off. His body was powerfully muscled, and at least half a dozen scars marked his skin. He wore a sword on his hip. The man whose shoulder he'd tapped followed him, sword already drawn. When they reached the center, Ulrich drew his own weapon, and the two men circled each other. Jan was momentarily distracted and moved closer to get a better view. He climbed onto a wagon as the men forming the circle closed in front of him, blocking his sight with their broad backs. From his vantage point on the wagon, Jan could see Ulrich and the other man as they moved around each other, gauging one another's defenses. Their movements were slow, but precise and disciplined. Suddenly, Ulrich's opponent lunged, bringing his sword up in a sinuous arc that Jan thought was going to take Ulrich's left arm off at the shoulder, but Ulrich twisted at the waist, his own blade coming up to neatly parry the attack as the sound of metal on metal rang out. Ulrich's opponent stepped back and began circling again. The fight transfixed Jan. He knew they were only practicing, but he felt a rush of excitement as the two men lunged and parried, the deadly blades coming within inches of their skin, but never touching. It was clear even to Jan's unpracticed eye that Ulrich was the superior fighter. The other man was learning from a master. As a boy, he'd played with sticks and wooden blades, and he'd learned how to handle a knife from his father, but all that he'd learned was clumsy by comparison. There was precision and intelligence behind the movements of the two swordsmen. It was almost like a dance as the two men moved, circling one another, slow and stately, but this was no lover's courtship. It was a dance where death stood in silent attendance, And if there was an embrace, it would be one of steel and flesh. Gradually the pace picked up, the blades blurring with speed, though still not with the quickness of an actual fight. He didn't notice Tyree standing beside the wagon until he spoke, the man's deep voice coming up as if out of the earth. "They'll be at it for hours. Yurik will have them all practice until well after noon, with only a short break for their midday meal. Speaking of which, I imagine you're somewhat hungry. Have you eaten?" Jan stared at him a moment before shaking his head. "Well then, let's get you some breakfast and then we can talk. Talus tells me he gave you a talk blade." Jan's hand strayed to the knife at his hip and Tyree nodded. "He said he tried to teach you how to activate the runes, but you were too stupid with sleepiness. Come, let's get some breakfast, and then I'll show you how to activate them. A talk blade is little more than a piece of metal. If you don't know the sequences, a nohetka won't even feel it in his chest, and a feral, well, he'll just be furious that you stuck him when he wasn't looking." Jan jumped down from the wagon, looking over his shoulder once. Yurik and the other man were still moving, their pace picking up so that it was difficult to see their swords as anything but a blur, and the air was filled with the loud metallic clang of their combat, but he had noticed the blades when they were drawn. The swords, like his dagger, were talk weapons. He spent the better part of the morning with Tyree, going over the runes on his knife. Tyree wasn't content only to show him how to activate the runes. He went into detail about their origin and relationships with one another. He held Jan's dagger in his hand, his fingers tracing the runes as he spoke. The runes are symbols of power. They represent the faces of God, whom we sometimes call virtues. Many ages past, the virtues abandoned the world to Malacephus when mankind rejected them and embraced their fallen brother as a god. Eager for their worship, Malacephus promised power to the ambitious, glory to the proud, pleasure to the hedonist, wealth to the avaricious, and to a few of his favored, immortality as one of the feral. Nos, the virtue of justice, did not leave the world entirely at his mercy. She bound him to the Sepinal Mountains, cursing him so he could never leave, or if he did, he would become as a man, powerless and subject to death. For though the virtues departed, the power of Malacephus was constrained. Nevertheless, men found their way to Malacephus's realm and began again to worship him. Thus it was that Malacephus grew in power and malice, and in time found the beckoning with which he broke his prison, and he set foot again in the world, establishing a prince in Jarik. For though the beckoning allowed Malacephus to roam the world in spirit, yet his flesh remains bound. It is from Jarik, through his prince, that he rules the world. So Malacephus filled the world with the beckoning, and many bowed down and worship him, deceived by his lies, for the dead are beautiful, and their lot seems desirable, and the lusts of men are sated in the temples of the fallen virtue. So they sing songs to him, and make of their brethren sacrifices in his name. But the men of the East were not fooled, and would not worship Malacephus. To them the virtues gave the sumis and the runes, that they might ward themselves from the endless hordes of the dead. The secret of the runes are hidden in the sumis, in riddles and parables, so that a man must learn the path to wisdom before he walked the path to power. The runes predate the Exodus, but the virtues remade them and endowed them with power when Malacephus broke free of his prison. Each rune has an affiliation with one or more of the virtues. This one here, his finger traced the fine detail of a rune so small Jan could barely make it out, represents truth, and its strongest affiliation is with this one, Solf, which is humility. They are lesser runes, having no power in themselves, but when set in the circles correctly, they in some ways are more potent than the great runes. Great runes are more powerful, but they are constantly drawing at the powers of the universe. They eat away at whatever they're etched in. Gradually, over time, they destroy it. All the runes erode over time, as the power they channel cannot be fully contained by them. But great runes are always active. A small amount of power leaks through. This is dangerous, for the Phelan can sense the runes, and they are more dangerous than nohetka or feral, made in the image of the Elan, the shepherds of men, whom Malacifus betrayed and destroyed. The Phelan are forged of the Beckoning, and are Malacifus's deadliest servants. They are drawn to the power of the runes. It would not do for us to carry weapons that gave us away to our enemies. The runes are a gift from the virtues, their last gift. There are many runes in the world of men, but only the runes of the Summis have power. Jan struggled to understand what Tyree was teaching him, but though he studied the shapes carefully, they didn't look like anything but scratches, and he had trouble telling one from another. His education had been rudimentary. He was, after all, a villager for whom writing and reading were unnecessary tools. His time had been better spent learning a craft he could make his living with, and while he could make the mark that was his name, and count the coins in his pocket, when he had some it wasn't much more than that, Jan knew that the nohetka and feral were the hands and eyes of the fallen virtue, and it was said he could look out of their eyes and speak with their tongues. But the runes made no sense to him. They were things of magic, and he couldn't understand them. Runes and sorcery were things for scholars. What little he knew of them concerned the wards set in the walls and over the gates of a village. Without an idea or a word to associate them with, he had difficulty telling them apart, which wasn't surprising because, as Tyree told him, there were over 600 runes, lesser and greater. Trying to remember the relations each had with the other was impossible. After a fruitless hour, Tyree stopped and asked him, "Boy, can you read at all?" Jan hesitated a moment, shamed by his ignorance, before shaking his head. Tyree sighed and reached out to pat his knee. "It's all right, but if you're going to work with the runes, you'll have to learn them first. You can't go around activating runes without understanding the consequences, and believe me, there are consequences." So the days passed and turned into weeks, and the weeks became months as Jan struggled to learn the runes. He spent long hours in the evening with Tyree, learning their meanings and their makings, but he still did not speak. Tyree taught him mundane runes first, for though these basic forms had no power, they were the foundation upon which the runes of power lay. They comprised written language, and it was with these mundane runes that scholars recorded history and kings wrote their edicts. More importantly, at least in Tyree's mind, the Book of the Summis was written in mundane runes. Jan had never seen a copy of the Summis, the book of wisdom written by the virtue Toama-Lees. The Summis contained the face of God, and from its pages rune masters learned their art, but if Tyree had a copy, he never showed it to Jan. The word Summis, he learned, meant all things manifest. It was also the name of the circle in which rune masters set their runes. A Summis, which was sometimes called the 114th great rune, and sometimes the compass rune, though it wasn't a rune at all, was the foundation of all rune magic. It comprised a circle divided into 8 equal segments. The points of each segment were connected, forming 2 squares at the heart of the circle, each set at a 45-degree angle to the other. The Summis held 24 hollows, wherein runes, greater or lesser, were set. And this was where the secret of the Summis manifested itself, both the book and the rune circle that shared its name, for if the runes were not set correctly in accordance with their associations, a rune circle might be impotent or useless. The true mastery of runes did not lay in knowing their shapes and forms, but in their associations. Simply cutting a circle and scribing runes in the hollows was not enough. One had to know which runes strengthened another, or worked in conjunction with each other. The secret of these associations hid within the Book of Summis. A circle was relatively simple and, as a result, the potency was less than that of a greater summis. If you wanted to scribe a more potent spell, such as a warding, you would have to set the runes in the greater summis, which comprised 2 or more interconnected circles. There was no limit to the number of circles that might comprise a great summis. It was clear to Jan that mastery of the runes could take a lifetime, and he soon despaired of ever mastering them. He diverted himself from the tedium of studying with Tyree by spending his mornings with the other men of the camp, learning a different discipline from Yurik. Unlike the runes, the sword made sense to Jan. It felt right in his hands, and the weight of it straining his muscles as he practiced with the men of the camp was real and tangible and easy to grasp. But Jan did not give up entirely on the runes. As the weeks wore on, he spent his evenings learning about the runes and different Summisarian masters from Tyree. He was surprised that the Tyir learned the making of runes from the Summisarians, and that Tokblades were first made by Summisarians centuries before they passed the secret on to the Tyir. In the mornings, he would line up with the other men of the camp, stripped to the waist, his narrow shoulders, slender arms, and thin chest painfully contrasting with their brawn. There wasn't a man among them who was as thin as Jan was, but this didn't hold them back during their practices. They pushed him as hard as any other man, knowing that if a man took it upon himself to learn the sword, he must give it everything he had. His enemies would show no mercy, and so they showed no mercy when he practiced with them. At first, it seemed cruel, but gradually he came to understand what they were doing. When Yurik paired him up with a sparring partner, the other man pushed Jan to the point of exhaustion, until he could barely stand, and the sword in his hands, though made of wood, felt like 100 pounds of solid lead. His arms, back and chest were covered with bruises from the wooden practice swords, and his ribs ached from the constant onslaught, but he didn't give up. With every blow he took, he learned something new. Every morning the Tyir formed a circle, and every morning Jan made his way to the circle, moving stiffly from the previous day's practice. Each morning Yurik would give him a different partner, and each day Jan would take his drubbing in silence, learning from his mistakes and listening to his fellows as they gave him pointers. Often Yurik would spar with Jan, or stand behind him holding his arms or positioning his legs and torso correctly as he lectured him on the art of swordsmanship. Jan was surprised to learn that swordplay was more than swinging steel. It was more than knowing how to move one's body with the blade in your hands. There was a philosophy that mirrored in some ways the teachings of the Summis that Tyree was giving him. There are 5 disciplines a man must master if he will master the sword, Yurik said. First is the earth, second is water, third is fire, and fourth is wind. The 5th is the void. You must master each in turn, and when you come to the void, you will have mastered the sword. In the void, there is no fear, no hate, only purpose. The first discipline is earth, and from it you will learn not to fear death. This is true of all men. We should not fear death, but a warrior is himself a harbinger of death. He wields it and is, to a degree, its master. A man who is not a warrior may fight, but he cannot hope for victory against a trained enemy. A warrior can, and like a farmer who tames the land to bring forth the harvest, a warrior may bring forth a harvest from death. Thus, the first discipline is the discipline of earth. The runes and the sword both took discipline and self-mastery, and Jan found a kind of peace in them. While Yurik lectured him on balance and footing, Tyree spoke about truth and moral certitude. Knowing what one believed and standing by it was not the same as knowing the truth and standing by it. Belief could be wrong. Men made mistakes in judgment, both in battle and in choosing what to believe. Both mistakes could be costly. But where a mistake on the battlefield meant you lost your life, a mistake in choosing one's beliefs could cost a person their soul. Tyree's lectures made Jan uncomfortable, but he pushed his doubts aside, focusing instead on the runes and the sword, and the power they gave him over his fears, and the hope they gave him for revenge. The seed of his hate had taken root, and coloured the intent of his studies. Though he thought he had locked all his emotions securely down, his hate was insidious. Locked behind the walls of his mind, it might be, but like Malacifus, it found a way out of its prison and secretly stole throughout him, filling him with a dark purpose. Jan knew that the man who conquered himself made his flesh subject to his will, that if he reigned in his passions and emotions, he could master any skill or discipline he chose. He applied that focus to learning the sword, though he did not entirely lose interest in the runes. Of the two, however, only one seemed to offer a path to avenge his family. The thoughts of suicide passed, replaced with a burning desire to destroy anything and anyone associated with Malacifus. It was not long before Tyree and Yurik noticed Jan's obsession. He soon surpassed the other men in swordsmanship, but Tyree held back in what he taught Jan. The young man learned the runes at an alarming speed, but he failed to grasp the lessons in wisdom. There was only so much a man could do with a sword, no matter what his skill. But the runes held tremendous power, and Tyree was reluctant to teach them without also imparting the principles of virtue that Tuamalis had set forth to temper that power. To Yurik, the obsession seemed a normal reaction to the boy's loss. He had experienced it himself, while Tyree, who had joined the Tyr as a rune master, had not. In fact, most of the Tyr understood the passion that fueled Jan's obsession, even if they didn't fully appreciate its potency, so they admired his dedication rather than feared it. But Tyree saw something unwholesome in it. He knew that just as draining poison from a chalice and then filling it with water would still poison the water, so too, if a man's heart were poisoned, all he undertook would be poisoned. The sword and the runes were the extent of Jan's existence. In his waking hours, nothing else mattered. He made no friends, formed no bonds with the other Tyr. Even in his sleep, though he slept with the other men, he kept himself from them, with his arms and legs pulled in tight to his chest. It reminded Yurik of the first night after SOMMERSTONE, when he'd found the young survivor curled in sleep at the edge of the camp, a tock blade clutched to his chest, tears streaming from his closed eyes. In his dreams, the boy had at last found a way to mourn his loss. Months had passed, and he had not found his voice. In his heart, Yurik felt the seeds of worry and doubt. Jan knew nothing of Yurik and Tyree's fears. He focused so intently on what he learned that the looks of concern and the hints they dropped when they spoke to him failed to register in his mind. Daily practice with the sword soon built up his arms and chest, cording them with the lean, hard muscles that are the boon of youth and activity. His upper body was muscular, but Jan was careful to work on his legs as well. He ran and leapt daily, building those muscles up too. He never forgot the desperation of leaping up and falling short of a tree branch while death closed in on him. The memory only reinforced Yurik's lessons. As for the runes, he could write well enough, and often did in response to a question, but he still did not speak. Jan continued to split his time between working with Tyree, learning the runes, and practicing weapons with Yurik and the other men. The runes intrigued and fascinated him, and he came to appreciate the power that existed even in mundane ones, that though they could not channel any energy, they had the power to record a man's words and thoughts. Jan sensed Tyree's reluctance to teach him more of the runes, which was fine with Jan. The sword also called to him, the solid weight of steel in his hand, the protest of his muscles as he raised the heavy weapon, sweat beading on his skin as his heart pounded, fueled the ember that had taken root in his heart. His blood burned when he held the sword. It was the only time he ever felt alive. He could see the use of the runes only so far as they served him in destroying the servants of Malacifus. And as far as he could see, the sword was a better tool for that. A little over 8 months after he had joined Urik's camp, he sat going over a scroll with the names of the great runes. He had his shirt off and held a poultice against a large, ugly bruise. Urik was the only one who could still lay the blade on him, though it happened less now. The blow had stung, splitting the skin, a hard lesson against overconfidence, for Jan had landed a blow on Urik only moments before. In his excitement at besting his master, he'd let his guard down. His side hurt and made it difficult to concentrate. There were no copies of the great runes on the scroll, only their names spelled out in mundane script. Jan knew a handful of their shapes by heart. He resisted the urge to visualize them. Tyree had warned him that a rune, whether a great one or one of the lesser runes, could be cut in the mind. One seldom cut runes in anything less substantial than stone or metal, though it could be done. The energy they pulled at eroded whatever substance held them. The less substantial it was, the quicker it eroded. When he needed to practice scribing runes, he used a rune box filled with sand. The power eroded the shapes in the sand quickly, so that pent-up energy was released before it could do any harm. He'd lost count of how many times he'd formed a rune incorrectly and been rewarded with a face full of hot sand. There was no danger in visualizing the lesser runes, which remained inert until activated. But a great rune formed in the mind would channel energies, and those energies could blast the mind of the caster. Only a fool, Tyree had told him, or a desperate man scribes a great rune in his mind. Tyree was at his table, hunched over a rune wheel he was cutting into a flat piece of obsidian. Jan stood up, his eyes watering from reading, and his side aching from where Urik had struck him. He had a headache from trying to grasp the meaning of the runes and their various relationships. Of the lesser runes, a name that Jan thought ironic, considering that there certainly weren't fewer of them. There were 503. Each had a relationship with one or more of the virtues, and consequently each other. Trying to grasp the almost infinite ways the runes could be set in a circle was giving him a headache. He didn't even want to think about the possibilities that setting several circles in a great sumis would give rise to. He needed a break. Learning the names of the runes had been easy compared to struggling with their thousands of relationships. He went over to Tyree's table to watch the man work. Tyree was etching the surface of the black rock with a fine point tool, an awl of some sort, but the tip was needle-sharp. He was making a warding token and had already cut 6 circles within the sumis. Jan could see the fine lines of it, thin as a hair, and Tyree was now placing a smaller rune in each of the hours of the compass. He had done all but the last hour and was working on that now. The stone was only 2.5 inches across, and Tyree's workmanship was exquisite. Minutes passed, stretching out to an hour and then another, while Jan watched the fine etchings grow and twist on the stone's black surface. Tyree's skill fascinated him, and when the rune master finally finished, Jan longed to hold the stone, to study its pattern. It was as much a work of art as it was a work of magic. Tyree set his tools down and gently wiped the fine grit of the etching away with a soft cloth before turning and holding the stone out to Jan. Urik came up behind Jan. Sweat drenched his brow, and he had his shirt draped over one shoulder. There was a bruise on his chest where Jan had gotten in a lucky blow of his own. Jan did not notice him. He took the stone and studied the pattern cut into its surface. The wheel comprised no less than 6 summis, each overlapping the other. Tyree had placed a rune in the hours of each summis, so that there were dozens, if not hundreds of runes cut into its surface. He was no judge of such things, but he knew that a ward such as this must be valuable. He held his hand out so that Tyree could take the stone back, but Tyree placed his hand over Jan's and closed his eyes. For a moment, Jan felt the stone grow warm in his palm. When Tyree removed his hand, Jan was astonished to see that the carving had disappeared. The surface of the stone was smooth, as if it had never been cut. Jan turned it over, but the bottom was also smooth. He looked up, curiosity blazing in his eyes. Tyree smiled and spoke. "They're set in the stone's heart. All great wards are made thus. They last longer, and the flow of power is cleaner." Jan made to hand the stone back, still warm with the power of the runes, but Tyree shook his head. "Keep it." He picked up a piece of quartz, the size of Jan's thumb, and handed it to him. Jan looked at the stone and saw a single rune cut into it, but like the obsidian, the surface was smooth. The rune had been set inside. Jan could feel the warmth of the quartz like a beam of sunlight in his hand. Tyree said, "That is the great rune Sep. I haven't taught you that one yet. It is the greatest of the binding runes, and it is the only rune, lesser or greater, that does not erode what it is set in. I use it to bind sunlight to crystals, such as this quartz. The sun is not easily caught, and only a great rune can bind it. We place these stones in the funerary jars of the dead, so that our loved ones will never be in the dark. One rests with your family. This one is for you." Tyree did not look at Yurik, who still stood behind the boy. He could sense that something was happening. The boy's shoulders were tense. His hand was shaking ever so slightly as he clutched the quartz burial stone. He lifted his head and stared into Tyree's eyes as his lips formed a single word. "Sep," he said, his voice a whisper. It was the first word he'd spoken since Summerstone. Tyree smiled and nodded, shifting his gaze to Yurik. The boy turned, and Yurik smiled as he spoke. "Hello, Sep." The long silence was broken, and Sep of the Tyre was born.